March 1849. Richmond, Virginia, the tobacco factory floor. Henry Brown watched the wagon disappear down the cobblestone street. His wife Nancy, 8 months pregnant, sat in chains beside their 3 children. The youngest was crying. Nancy turned back one final time before the wagon rounded the corner toward the auction houses in North Carolina. Gone. Brown had worked 12 years in Richmond's tobacco warehouses, renting a small house where his family lived together. Every month, he'd paid Nancy's master to keep them safe from sale. A promise, a gentleman's agreement. The master had lied. Now his family belonged to a minister 200 miles south. Brown would never see them again. His children would grow up without knowing their father's face. His unborn child would be born into bondage, never having heard his voice. The overseers at the tobacco factory knew what had happened. They watched Brown return to work the next morning, expecting him to accept it. That's what enslaved people did. They endured, they survived, they kept working. The system was designed to be inescapable. Richmond sat in the heart of Virginia, surrounded by patrols, informants, and professional slave catchers who earned fortunes returning runaways. Every road was watched, every river monitored. The Underground Railroad operated in whispers, but its routes were increasingly compromised. White authorities had spent decades perfecting the system. There was no way out that they hadn't already closed. That's what they believed. Brown stood at his workstation, hands moving automatically through the tobacco leaves, but his mind worked differently now. Conventional escape was impossible. The routes everyone knew about were the routes that got you captured, tortured, or killed. He needed something no one had ever tried before. Then it came to him, an idea so audacious, so insane, that no slave catcher would ever think to look for it. He'd mail himself to freedom. Richmond's slave catchers had perfected their system over decades. Every road leading north had checkpoints. Every ferry crossing required documentation. Professional bounty hunters earned more returning runaways than most merchants made in a year. The city's location made it nearly impregnable, situated deep in Virginia's interior, surrounded by hostile territory in every direction. White authorities believed they'd thought of everything. Runaways who tried to walk north were tracked by dogs within hours. Those who attempted to steal horses were caught at the first town. Forged freedom papers were scrutinized by experts who could spot inconsistencies instantly. The Underground Railroad existed, but its routes were increasingly compromised. Informants infiltrated abolitionist networks. Rewards for information grew larger each year. No one escaped from Richmond. That's what the overseers told each other. Brown understood the system's logic perfectly. Conventional escape relied on deception, pretending to be free, hiding in wagon beds, traveling at night through forests. But those methods had been anticipated. Slave catchers knew the patterns. They built their entire industry around predicting where runaways would go and how they get there. So Brown needed something they'd never predict. Through his church choir, he knew James C.A. Smith, a free black man who moved between Richmond's white and black communities. Smith listened to Brown's idea with a mixture of fascination and horror. Mail himself in a box? The plan was insane, but Smith knew the alternatives. He agreed to help. They needed a white accomplice, someone who could legally ship cargo without arousing suspicion. Smith knew a shoemaker named Samuel Smith, a gambling man, morally flexible, willing to take risks for money. When Brown approached him with $86, more than half his life savings, Samuel Smith's eyes narrowed. The amount was substantial. The risk was enormous. Virginia law didn't play around with slave stealing. White men caught helping runaways faced years in prison. But Samuel Smith had debts. He took the money. The 3 men met in secret, working out details that would either result in freedom or death. The box needed to be large enough for Brown to survive inside, but small enough to pass as normal cargo. Too big would attract attention, too small would kill him. They settled on dimensions: 3 feet long, 2.5 feet deep, 2 feet wide. Barely enough room for a man to crouch. Brown would have a small bladder of water and a few biscuits. The journey from Richmond to Philadelphia would take roughly 27 hours by the fastest route, assuming everything went perfectly. Samuel Smith had a carpentry shop build the box, claiming he needed it for equipment. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was white, free, trusted. But Smith understood the plan required coordination on the northern end. He couldn't just ship a box to a random Philadelphia address and hope for the best. He traveled north to meet with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, specifically James Miller McKim and William Still, men who operated safe houses and coordinated rescues. The Philadelphia abolitionists listened to the plan with a combination of awe and dread. No one had ever attempted anything like this. The risks were staggering. If handlers heard Brown moving inside the box, he'd be discovered immediately. If the journey took longer than expected, he'd suffocate. If the box was damaged in transit, he'd be exposed. If authorities inspected cargo at any point, he'd be returned to Richmond in chains, or worse. But the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society agreed to receive the shipment at their office. They'd be waiting, watching, praying. Back in Richmond, Brown prepared himself mentally. He'd spent weeks thinking through every possible scenario. The box would be labeled dry goods and marked this side up with care. Adams Express Company handled the shipping. They were known for efficiency and discretion with valuable cargo. On March 23, 1849, everything was ready. Brown said goodbye to the few people he trusted. He didn't know if he'd survive the journey. He didn't know if the plan would work. He knew the box would be handled by strangers who had no idea a human being was inside. Brown had one advantage the slave catchers didn't anticipate. They'd never considered that someone would voluntarily seal themselves in a coffin-sized box and trust the postal system with their life. He climbed inside. Samuel Smith nailed the lid shut. The journey began. The first hours weren't the worst. That distinction belonged to what came later. Brown felt the box lift from the ground as handlers loaded it onto Samuel Smith's wagon. The initial movement was relatively gentle. Smith knew what he was carrying. But once the box reached the Adams Express Company depot, that knowledge disappeared. From that point forward, Brown became cargo, nothing more than dry goods being shipped north. The Express Company workers had no reason to suspect anything unusual. The box looked ordinary. The paperwork was legitimate. Samuel Smith paid for expedited shipping and left without incident. The handlers lifted the crate and carried it toward the first transport. A wagon bound for the railroad depot. They flipped it upside down. Brown felt the world invert. His head dropped toward what was now the bottom of the box, his body weight pressing down on his neck and shoulders. Blood rushed to his skull. The small bladder of water swung uselessly above him, just out of reach. His knees jammed against the wooden lid, now beneath him. The 3 small air holes he drilled became his only connection to the outside world, but in this position, they provided barely enough oxygen. He couldn't move enough to right himself. The box was too small. Any significant shifting would create noise, and noise meant discovery. Discovery meant torture and death, not just for him, but for everyone who'd helped him. Samuel Smith would face prison. James C.A. Smith would be arrested. The Philadelphia abolitionists would be prosecuted. So Brown stayed silent. Minutes stretched into hours. The veins in his temples swelled. His eyes felt like they would burst from their sockets. Pressure built behind his face until he thought his skull might crack. Every breath became a conscious effort. The air inside the box grew thick and stale. The wagon hit a pothole. Brown's head slammed against the wooden planks. Stars exploded across his vision. He bit his tongue to keep from crying out, tasting blood. The handlers outside laughed about something. They had no idea. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon stopped. Brown heard voices, the sounds of a train depot. Handlers grabbed the box again. For a moment, he felt himself being lifted, then rotated, right side up. Air rushed to his lungs as his body settled back into its crouched position. The relief was overwhelming, but it was temporary. The train journey brought new torments. The box sat in a freight car with dozens of other crates, all stacked haphazardly. Each time the train lurched forward or braked, Brown's body slammed against the interior walls. His muscles cramped from staying in the same position. His water was nearly gone. The biscuits he'd brought were crushed and scattered somewhere in the darkness below him. Hours passed. The train stopped. Handlers transferred cargo to a steamboat. Brown felt himself lifted, carried, then dropped onto a deck. The impact rattled his bones. Someone placed another crate on top of his box. The added weight pressed down on the lid, which pressed down on his back. He couldn't straighten even slightly. Breathing became harder. The steamboat's engine rumbled beneath him. Smoke and heat from the boilers made the air inside his box suffocating. Sweat poured from his body, dehydrating him further. His tongue swelled. His throat felt like sandpaper. The small water bladder was empty now. Another transfer, another wagon. This time the handlers were rougher. They threw the box, actually threw it, into the wagon bed. Brown's shoulder slammed against the side. Pain shot through his arm. He thought something might have cracked, but he couldn't tell. Everything hurt now. His entire body was one continuous ache. Then they flipped him upside down again. This time was worse. He'd been in the box for over 20 hours. His body had weakened. The blood rushing to his head felt like knives piercing his brain. His vision went dark. He might have passed out. He couldn't be sure. Time became meaningless. There was only the box, the darkness, the pain, and the desperate need to remain silent. Brown later wrote that he was resolved to conquer or die. In those hours upside down, death seemed increasingly likely. But if he died, he'd die free, or at least die trying. That was more than his wife and children had, more than millions of others would ever have. Another railroad, another transfer. His body had stopped responding normally. His muscles twitched involuntarily. His fingers were numb. He couldn't feel his feet. But still he remained silent. Still he endured. 26 hours, 27. The box moved one final time. Brown heard different voices now, urgent, careful. Someone said something about Philadelphia. Someone else said the package had arrived. Footsteps approached, close now, very close. A knock on the box, 3 taps. Then a voice, muffled through the wood. "All right?" Brown tried to answer. His throat was too dry. He swallowed, forcing moisture back into his mouth. Tried again. "All right, sir." The sound of tools, prying, nails being removed. Light began seeping through cracks in the wood. The lid lifted away. March 24, 1849, early morning. Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society Office, Philadelphia. James Miller McKim, William Still, and several other abolitionists stood in a circle around the wooden crate that had just arrived. They'd been waiting since yesterday, checking the door every few minutes, listening for the express company's delivery wagon. When it finally came, they'd carried the box inside with trembling hands. Now they stared at it. 3 feet long, 2.5 feet deep, 2 feet wide, labeled dry goods with "This side up with care" stamped on the exterior. The box sat in the center of the room, silent and still, too still. McKim had helped coordinate dozens of escapes through the Underground Railroad. He'd hidden runaways in secret compartments, forged freedom papers, bribed officials, and risked imprisonment more times than he could count. But he'd never done anything like this, never received a human being through the postal system. The journey from Richmond should have taken 26 to 27 hours. The box had been in transit for exactly that long. But what condition would Brown be in after spending more than a full day sealed inside a container barely large enough to crouch in? What if the ventilation holes hadn't provided enough air? What if handlers had damaged the box? What if Brown had suffocated somewhere between Virginia and Pennsylvania? McKim approached slowly. He knocked 3 times on the wooden lid. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "All right?" Silence. The abolitionists held their breath, then faint but unmistakable. "All right, sir." The room erupted. Men rushed forward with tools, hammers, pry bars, anything that could remove the nails quickly. McKim's hands shook as he worked. The nails resisted at first, driven deep by Samuel Smith to ensure the box wouldn't accidentally open during transit. One by one, they came free. The lid lifted away. Henry Brown rose from the box like a man resurrecting from a tomb. His clothes were soaked with sweat. His face was swollen, eyes bloodshot from hours spent upside down with blood pooling in his skull. His legs trembled as he tried to stand, muscles cramped from being locked in the same crouched position for 27 hours. He couldn't fully straighten at first. His body had molded itself to the box's dimensions. William Still reached out to steady him. Brown waved him off gently. He needed to stand on his own. Needed to prove to himself that he'd actually made it. That this wasn't a dream he'd conjured in the darkness of his wooden prison. He took one step, then another. His legs nearly gave out. The abolitionists caught him this time, lowering him into a chair. Someone brought water. Brown drank slowly, his throat raw and swollen. He'd finished his small water bladder within the first few hours of the journey. The last 20 hours had been without a drop. But he was alive, and he was free. The reality of it washed over him in waves. He'd left Richmond as property. He'd traveled 350 miles through the heart of slave territory. He'd passed through checkpoints, been handled by dozens of workers, been flipped upside down and dropped and thrown, and not one person had discovered him. The system designed to keep him imprisoned had delivered him to freedom. Brown's chest swelled, his throat loosened. And then he began to sing. The hymn poured out of him, words of thanksgiving, of deliverance, of resurrection. His voice filled the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society office. The abolitionists joined in, tears streaming down their faces. They'd witnessed something unprecedented, an escape so audacious, so improbable, that no one would believe it without seeing the box itself. McKim examined Brown's physical condition as he sang. The man had burns on one hand, deliberately inflicted with sulfuric acid, the day before his journey to get excused from work at the tobacco factory. His shoulders bore deep indentations from the box's walls. His knees were bruised and scraped. But miraculously, nothing was broken. No permanent damage. He'd survived what should have killed him. Over the next hours, Brown told his story. The loss of his wife Nancy and their 3 children sold away while she was 8 months pregnant. The months of grief and planning. The recruitment of James C.A. Smith and Samuel Smith. The construction of the box. The decision to trust his life to the postal system and the hands of strangers who had no idea what they were carrying. The Philadelphia abolitionists realized immediately what they had, a story that would shake the nation. Henry Brown's escape was unlike anything that had come before. It proved the desperate lengths people would go to for freedom. It exposed the moral bankruptcy of a system that forced a man to seal himself in a coffin-sized box to reunite with basic human dignity. Within days, Brown's story spread through abolitionist networks. Newspapers picked it up. Speaking invitations flooded in. The man who'd mailed himself to freedom became an instant symbol of resistance, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human desire for liberty. Henry Box Brown had arrived in Philadelphia as cargo. He emerged as a legend. Within 48 hours of emerging from his box, Henry Brown's story had reached every abolitionist network from Boston to Baltimore. Newspapers picked it up immediately. The man who'd mailed himself to freedom became the most talked about escape in American history. The Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society understood what they had, a narrative so extraordinary that it challenged every assumption about what people would endure for liberty. Brown's escape wasn't a midnight run through forests or a hidden passage on the Underground Railroad. It was a direct confrontation with the system itself, using the South's own infrastructure against it. The audacity was unprecedented. James Miller McKim arranged Brown's first public appearance within a week. The hall in Philadelphia filled beyond capacity. People stood in doorways, pressed against walls, desperate to see the man who'd survived 27 hours sealed in a box barely larger than a coffin. When Brown walked onto the stage, the audience rose in standing ovation before he'd spoken a single word. Brown told his story simply. He described losing Nancy and their 3 children, watching them disappear down Richmond streets toward auction houses in North Carolina. He explained the planning, the construction of the box, the decision to trust his life to handlers who had no idea what they were carrying. He didn't dramatize the suffering. The facts were dramatic enough. When he described the hours spent upside down, blood pooling in his skull, certain he would die, but determined to die free, women in the audience wept openly. Men clenched their fists. This wasn't abstract philosophy about human rights. This was a man who'd survived torture to claim his own life. The speaking invitations multiplied exponentially. Boston, New York, Providence, every major city in the Northeast wanted Henry Box Brown on their stage. He became more than a symbol. He became proof. Proof that the desire for freedom could overcome anything. Proof that human ingenuity could defeat institutionalized oppression. Proof that the system wasn't invincible. Brown worked with abolitionists to create the Great Panorama of American Slavery, a massive painted scroll depicting scenes from bondage to liberation, culminating in his own escape. He toured with the panorama, unrolling it section by section while narrating his experiences. Audiences had never seen anything like it. The combination of visual art and first-hand testimony created an emotional impact that written pamphlets couldn't match. But Brown's celebrity came with consequences. In Richmond, authorities were furious. The escape humiliated them. Brown had stolen himself using Adams Express Company, a legitimate business operating under Virginia law. The implications were terrifying for those who profited from human bondage. If one man could mail himself north, others might try. The system's vulnerability had been exposed. Samuel Smith, the white shoemaker who'd helped Brown, made a catastrophic decision in May 1849. Just 2 months after Brown's successful escape, he attempted to repeat the scheme, shipping 2 more people in boxes from Richmond to Philadelphia. This time, authorities were watching. Smith was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 6.5 years in the state penitentiary. The charge was officially listed as enticing slaves to be boxed up, a crime that hadn't existed before Brown's escape. James C.A. Smith, the free black man who'd connected Brown with Samuel Smith, was arrested in September 1849. The authorities wanted someone to punish for their embarrassment. But the evidence against James Smith was circumstantial, and a divided panel of magistrates couldn't reach consensus. He escaped conviction and fled north to join Brown in Boston by December. Brown knew he wasn't safe. He was the most famous fugitive in America, but that fame made him a target. Bounty hunters earned fortunes returning runaways to the South. Brown's former master could claim ownership and demand his return under existing laws. Then came August 1850, Providence, Rhode Island. Brown was walking through the street when he was attacked, grabbed by men who tried to force him into a carriage. He fought them off with help from bystanders, but the message was clear. Nowhere in the United States was truly safe for him. 1 month later, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The new law was draconian. It required northern states to cooperate in returning escapees to southern owners. It denied accused fugitives the right to trial by jury. It imposed heavy fines on anyone who aided runaways. Federal marshals could conscript northern citizens to help capture fugitives. For Brown, the law was a death sentence. His fame made him impossible to hide. His face had been in newspapers across the country. Everyone knew his story. In October 1850, 18 months after emerging from his box in Philadelphia, Henry Brown boarded a ship bound for England. He took his panorama with him, along with James C.A. Smith. They would continue their work from exile, telling Brown's story to British audiences who'd never experienced the system firsthand, but understood its moral obscenity. Brown had escaped bondage by mailing himself north. Now he escaped America itself, carried across the Atlantic by the same courage that had sustained him through 27 hours in darkness. England, 1850, 1875. 25 years in exile. Henry Brown stepped off the ship in Liverpool with his panorama rolled under his arm and James C.A. Smith beside him. Britain had abolished the institution decades earlier, making it one of the few places where Brown could walk freely without fear of bounty hunters dragging him back across the Atlantic in chains. But Brown didn't come to England to hide, he came to fight. Within weeks of arriving, he was on stage in Manchester, unrolling his massive panorama, Mirror of Slavery, before packed audiences who'd never witnessed the American system firsthand. The painted scenes depicted everything from auction blocks to plantation labor, culminating in Brown's own escape. He narrated each section, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience. British audiences were transfixed. They'd read about the American system in newspapers, heard abolitionists speak in abstract terms about human rights and moral philosophy. But Brown made it real. He didn't theorize, he testified. When he described losing Nancy and their 3 children, the audience understood it wasn't metaphor. When he explained the 27 hours sealed in darkness, they grasped the desperation that drove men to choose potential death over continued bondage. Brown's performances evolved. He added theatrical elements, incorporating music and dramatic staging. He became a mesmerist, what audiences called a hypnotist, demonstrating his ability to influence volunteers from the crowd. Some critics dismissed it as entertainment, missing the deeper message. Brown was proving that Black Americans possessed intelligence, creativity, and talent that the Southern system denied. In 1851, Brown married Jane Floyd, an English woman who became his partner both in life and performance. The marriage challenged racial boundaries that existed even in Britain. They had a daughter, Annie, who would eventually join Brown on stage, performing alongside her father and mother as part of the family act. But Brown's work extended beyond performance. In 1852, a British newspaper published a scathing review that trivialized his panorama and questioned whether conditions were truly as horrible as he depicted. Brown sued for libel. The case went to court and Brown won. A remarkable victory for a Black man in 1850s Britain against established media. The verdict validated his testimony and established that his account of the system's brutality was factually accurate, not exaggeration. For 25 years, Brown toured England, Scotland, and Wales. He refined his act continuously, adding magic tricks and illusions. Professor H. Box Brown became known across Britain as an entertainer, but his performances always carried the underlying message of resistance. He sometimes climbed into his original box as part of the show, a resurrection performed nightly, reminding audiences of the journey that had brought him to their stages. The American Civil War erupted in 1861. Brown followed the news from across the ocean, watching as the nation tore itself apart over the very system he'd escaped. When the war ended in 1865 and the institution was formally abolished, Brown was 50 years old. He'd spent 16 years in exile. Nancy, his first wife, remained somewhere in the American South. Their 3 children would be adults now if they'd survived. Brown had built a new life in England, but part of him remained in Richmond in that moment when the wagon had disappeared around the corner, carrying his family away forever. In 1875, Brown made a decision that surprised many who knew him. He returned to the United States, bringing Jane and their daughter Annie with him. The country had changed. The institution was gone. Constitutional amendments guaranteed rights that had been unthinkable when Brown sealed himself in a box 26 years earlier. Brown resumed performing, billing himself as Professor H. Box Brown, the man who mailed himself to freedom. American audiences who'd heard the legend decades earlier now saw him in person, older, grayer, but still commanding attention with the sheer audacity of his story. But America still wasn't entirely safe. Racial violence continued despite legal changes. Economic opportunities remained limited. So Brown made another move, this time north across the border to Canada. He settled first in London, Ontario, then finally in Toronto, where the growing Black community offered both security and audience. In Toronto, Brown continued performing into his 70s. The last documented performance was in Brantford, Ontario in February 1889, where he appeared alongside Jane and Annie. By then, Brown had been telling his story for 40 years, longer than he'd lived in bondage. He'd transformed himself from cargo to legend, from property to professor, from victim to victor. The man who'd survived 27 hours in a box had spent 4 decades proving that freedom was worth any price. June 15, 1897, Toronto, Ontario, Necropolis Cemetery. Henry Brown died at approximately 82 years old, 48 years after climbing into that wooden box in Richmond. He was buried in Toronto's Necropolis Cemetery, far from the Virginia plantation where he'd been born, far from the tobacco factory where he'd lost his family, far from the express depot where Samuel Smith had shipped him north like cargo. But his story didn't end with his burial. It had already become something larger than one man's escape. It had become proof. In the decades following Brown's journey, his name became synonymous with resistance and ingenuity. When people discussed the lengths that human beings would endure for freedom, they spoke of Henry Box Brown. When abolitionists needed an example of the system's cruelty and the courage it took to overcome it, they told his story. When critics claimed that people were content with bondage, Brown's 27 hours sealed in darkness stood as irrefutable contradiction. The box itself became a symbol. Reproductions appeared in museums and exhibitions across the North. Artists created lithographs showing the moment of Brown's emergence in Philadelphia, his arms raised in triumph, abolitionists gathering around in stunned celebration. The image, the resurrection of Henry Box Brown, circulated widely, becoming one of the most recognizable depictions of escape in American history. Brown's narrative, published in 1849, shortly after his arrival in Philadelphia, sold thousands of copies. Unlike many accounts that were mediated through white editors and publishers, Brown's story carried the weight of direct testimony. He didn't soften the horror of losing Nancy and their children. He didn't minimize the physical suffering of the journey. He didn't pretend that freedom came without cost. The panorama he created, Mirror of Slavery, traveled with him for decades, showing audiences in Boston, London, Manchester, and Toronto exactly what the system looked like from the inside. Brown understood that people needed to see, not just hear. The combination of visual art and personal testimony created an impact that abstract arguments about human rights couldn't match. But Brown's legacy extended beyond his immediate activism. His escape forced authorities in Richmond and throughout the South to confront an uncomfortable truth. The system they'd designed to be inescapable had a vulnerability. If one man could mail himself to freedom using their own postal service, what did that say about the system's supposed inevitability? Samuel Smith's imprisonment, 6.5 years for enticing slaves to be boxed up, created a new legal category. Authorities had to invent a crime to prosecute him because Brown's method was so unprecedented that existing laws didn't cover it. The trial and conviction received national attention, inadvertently publicizing the very method they were trying to suppress. After the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment abolished the institution in 1865, Brown's story took on new meaning. It became part of a larger narrative about resistance, proving that people had never accepted bondage passively. They'd fought it, escaped it, and risked everything to destroy it. Brown's journey was one of thousands of acts of resistance, but its audacity made it impossible to forget. When Brown returned to the United States in 1875, he brought with him 40 years of experience, proving black capability and intelligence. His performances as Professor H. Box Brown weren't just entertainment. They were demonstrations. Every magic trick, every act of mesmerism, every carefully orchestrated show challenged the racist assumptions that had justified bondage in the first place. His decision to continue climbing into the original box as part of his performances was deliberate. He could have left it behind, moved beyond that identity, but Brown understood the power of that moment, the resurrection, the emergence from darkness into light, from cargo to free man. He reenacted it hundreds of times over 40 years because audiences needed to witness what courage looked like. By the time Brown died in 1897, the world had changed dramatically from the one he'd escaped in 1849. But racial violence, economic oppression, and systemic discrimination persisted. Brown's story remained relevant because it demonstrated something fundamental. Human beings will risk everything for freedom, and ingenuity can overcome systems designed to be unbreakable. Today, Henry Box Brown is remembered as one of the Underground Railroad's most famous figures, though his method was decidedly different from the network of safe houses and secret routes typically associated with that term. He didn't travel the railroad, he mailed himself through it. His grave in Toronto's Necropolis Cemetery receives visitors from around the world. The headstone is simple. Henry Brown died June 15, 1897. But the story it represents is anything but simple. It's the story of a man who watched his family disappear and decided that death was preferable to continued bondage. A man who climbed into a coffin-sized box and trusted strangers with his life. A man who survived 27 hours of torture and emerged singing. Henry Brown's legacy isn't just that he escaped, it's that he proved the system's greatest weakness. It relied on convincing people that resistance was impossible. Brown's box, 3 feet long, 2.5 feet deep, 2 feet wide, became evidence that nothing is impossible when freedom is at stake.